The Mysterious Benedict Society by Trenton Lee Stewart. Read by Rosemary. The Mouse in the Culvert. As Rainey composed a more optimistic letter to his former tutor, indeed, even as in his mind he wrote the words, "And now our hopes really do lie with Kate," Kate was feeling less and less optimistic herself. Her problem wasn't finding Mr. Kern's secret computer room. Her problem was not getting caught. At first, everything had gone fine. Kate had flitted through the shadows behind the dormitory, and in no time had made her way down to the boulders behind the Institute Control Building, kicked open the secret entrance, and darted inside the foyer. It was here that the problems began. The ceilings had no crawl space, and the air vents were too small to accommodate her. She had no choice but to move about in the open, and it was open in the passage, as a quick peek from the foyer proved, open as bright as day. Not to mention it was hardly a short passage at all. Lined with doorways, it was stretched off into the distance where it finally turned a corner. Why had Sticky said it was short? Then Kate remembered the boys had been blindfolded. They must have thought it was short because they'd only gone a little way before Jackson had led them through a doorway and onto the tower steps. Any one of these near doorways might lead to the steps then. Should she try them all? As if in answer, about halfway down the passage, a door slid open and Jackson stepped out into the passage. Kate pulled back into the foyer and listened. No footsteps. She peeked out again. Jackson was leaning against the wall by the door, munching absently on a stick of licorice. He seemed relaxed, settled, as if he intended to stay there a while. Kate smiled. She thought it pretty likely he was guarding the tower steps. Now she just needed to get past him. Pulling out of view, Kate eased her slingshot from her bucket, snagged a marble into it, then peeked around the corner again. She waited a long minute, then another. Finally, the opportunity came. Jackson looked down to straighten his sash, mumbling something to himself. It was now or never. Jackson launched the marble down the passage. The marble shot over Jackson's head, struck the stone floor in the distance with a satisfying click, bounced off the far wall, and skittered around the corner. Jackson spat out his licorice and barked, "Who's there?" Not waiting for an answer, he ran down the passage and around the corner, and Kate dashed to the door he'd been guarding. Next to it was a numeric keypad. She hadn't counted on that, but if Mr. Kern hadn't changed the codes again... Her fingers flew across the numbers. The door opened. Kate leaped inside. Only then did she realize she was in an elevator. An elevator? Of course! How else would Mr. Kern get up to the Whispering Gallery in his wheelchair? He must not let his messengers use it. He did like his secrets, didn't he? Probably enjoyed the thought of the children laboring up all those steps, too. As the door slid closed, Kate saw the tower steps through an open doorway across the passage. Jackson had been guarding both entrances. There were only a few buttons inside the elevator. They were unlabeled, but it wasn't hard to guess that the top button would be for an entrance outside the Whispering Gallery, and the one below it. That would surely be the computer room. Kate stared longingly at the button, but of course she couldn't press it. She couldn't use the elevator. Jackson was sure to hear it. He was probably already coming back down the passage. And so Kate improvised. She emptied a bucket, flipped it over, and, standing atop on her tiptoes, unscrewed the maintenance panel above her. She'd never worked so quickly in her life. In no time, she tied her rope in place, gathered her bucket and things, and disappeared through the panel into the elevator shaft above. No sooner had Kate replaced the panel below her than the elevator door opened. Kate held perfectly still. She heard Jackson grunt. The door closed again. Kate flicked on her penlight. The elevator cable stretched high above her, disappearing into blackness. She took off her shoes and socks, slid the socks over her hands to protect them, and put her shoes back on. With her penlight clamped between her teeth, she started up, wasting no time. She had a very long, very difficult climb ahead of her. It was a very long, very difficult way to go, only to be disappointed. And despite the socks, the cable hurt her hands. The climb was exhausting, and when at last Kate came to a set of doors near the top, she found them impossible to pry open or peek through. Above them, another set of doors, which must open onto the passageway outside the Whispering Gallery, proved equally immovable. Then, squeezing past the winch and machinery at the top of the elevator shaft, if the elevator had started just then, she'd have been killed, Kate discovered that a vent cover she'd spotted was welded shut. The vent was too tiny to climb through anyway. She did manage to peer down through it, if only to make the following discouraging mental notes. In the foyer, 2 recruiters, very big and dangerous-looking, both wearing shock watches. Behind them, thick metal door, 3 manual locks in addition to an electronic keypad, one of the locks a combination. Air ducts, too small for Constance to fit through, even if greased. Ceiling, inaccessible. Windows, none. No windows, Kate thought, and no hope for entry. She couldn't even get into the room outside the computer room, much less into the computer room itself. It was hard to resist a sigh. She'd had grand visions of sabotaging the Whisperer, destroying its computers all by herself, ripping out cables, crushing components, stealing mysterious gizmos that could not be replaced. Not only would she be regarded as a hero, she proved once and for all that she could do everything alone, that she needed no one's help. But now she saw she could do no such thing. Not this time. Kate stiffened. In her disappointment, she had let her mind wander, and only now became aware that one of the recruiters was peering into the darkness in her direction. "McCraig," the recruiter said to his partner, "do you see something odd behind the vent there?" McCraig pulled out a flashlight. Nothing behind the vent. "Probably a mouse." "A talking mouse?" "That's not coming from the vent, you idiot. That's the executives coming up the steps. Got a new one taking the tour tonight, remember?" Kate, who had pulled back just in time, also heard the voices. They were just on the other side of the wall. "Part of your training," SQ was saying, his voice growing louder. "After I show you the ropes up here, you and I meet with Mr. Curran so he can explain some things to you." "Yes, you've already said that," said a testy voice. Martina Crow. "But why are you coming to the meeting? You've been an executive for almost a year now." "Well, you probably haven't noticed," SQ said, "but I'm a little slow on the pickup. Mr. Curran sometimes has me sit in on these tutorials to refresh my memory about certain things." Kate heard a derisive snort, then Jackson's voice saying, "Hold on, you two." She leaned and peeked through the vent again, but couldn't see him. The entrance from the tower steps was out of view. "McCraig," she heard Jackson say to the recruiter, "everything fine up here? Nothing unusual going on tonight?" "I'm telling you, Jackson," said SQ's voice, "it was probably a mouse." "We got mice too," said McCraig. "Other than that, all's fine." "Jackson takes his guard duty very seriously," SQ said knowingly. "Hey, it's Mr. Curran who wants security stepped up," Jackson snapped. "You got a problem with that, Mr. Curran, SQ?" "Of course not. I was just saying—" Kate didn't hear the rest. She was already easing her way down the elevator shaft again. She needed to beat Jackson back down so she could slip out. And then, what was this about a meeting with Mr. Curran? Maybe the night didn't have to be an entire loss. The trouble would be finding a way to eavesdrop on his office. Too risky going into the Institute Control Building, but maybe she could find another way. "And so you see, Martina," Mr. Curran said, rolling out from behind his desk, "after the improvement, most people will be much happier." "But not all," said SQ. "Isn't that right, Mr. Curran?" "Quite right, SQ. Unfortunately, there are some people whose natures incline them to be sad when others are happy." Martina was smiling. "May I assume," she said in a sly tone, "that these poor souls would not only be unhappy, which certainly is tragic enough, but might also cause trouble? Am I right that brains will not only help them feel better, it will make them more manageable?" "You understand perfectly," said Mr. Curran with an approving look. "And, SQ, I believe that explanation should satisfy you as well." If the explanation had not satisfied SQ, it had nonetheless created in him the strong impression that he ought to be satisfied, and so he laughed and said, "I see, yes, of course." Martina leaned forward in her chair. "One thing I'm still unclear on, though, is how brain sweeping works. It doesn't actually erase the memories?" "Not at all," Mr. Curran said. "Anyone who knows anything about the human mind understands that it never truly forgets anything. To completely erase memories is impossible. What is possible, however, is hiding memories from their owners. To use my favorite comparison, we sweep the old memories under a mental rug, hence the word brain sweeping, and there they remain hidden away, with no one the wiser." "And everyone happier," SQ said. "Yes, SQ," said Mr. Curran, with a significant look at Martina. She was a brand new executive, but already understood far more than SQ ever would. "Yes, my friend, everyone's happier." "Isn't it amazing?" SQ said to Martina. "I get goosebumps every time I learn it." "It is much the same with fears, you know," Mr. Curran said. "SQ, do you believe you have it down now? Would you like to explain to Martina how the Whisperer deals with fears?" "Oh, yes, of course I would," said SQ, reddening. "That is, I would, but you've forgotten?" Mr. Curran snapped, flashing a sneaky half-grin at Martina. Apparently he took pleasure in toying with SQ, which no doubt explained why Mr. Curran hadn't booted him off the island years ago. "Forgotten? Oh, no!" SQ cried in dismay. "No, I wouldn't say forgotten. You know nothing is ever truly forgotten. You said so yourself." Ha ha. He coughed. "It's just that you're so much more elegant than I am." I dare say that's true. Perhaps you also find me more eloquent than you. Very well, Eskew. I shall explain it, and you may nod along as always. Eskew nodded. Mr. Curran turned to Martina. You recall how your fears seem to disappear when you're seated in the Whisperer, do you not? Martina's expression sharpened with hunger. Absolutely, she breathed. SQ nodded. Of course you do. Again, the magic is in the messages. My Whisperer rewards your cooperation by sending extremely high-power messages that deny your fears. A simple procedure. Fears lurk just beneath the surface and are easy to detect. SQ nodded. So it's just a wonderful illusion, Martina said. That explains why the fears come back later. I've always wondered about that. When I'm in the Whisperer, they seem to have gone away forever. Mr. Curran laughed. Sadly, no. The only way fears truly disappear is if you confront them. But who in the world wishes to confront his or her worst fears? Not me, Martina said. SQ, already beginning to nod, checked himself and shook his head. Nobody does, said Mr. Curran, and now we were on the brink of offering the same peaceful contentment on a much grander scale. After the improvement, you see, everyone's greatest fear shall be drowned out by a message, much like the ones you receive in the Whisperer. It will be grand. I can't wait, SQ cried, unable to contain himself. To think that so many people will be so happy. Mr. Curran chuckled. You don't have long to wait, SQ. My modifications have gone much more quickly than I even hoped. I now fully expect the improvement to begin the day after tomorrow, perhaps even sooner. The day after tomorrow? Martina exclaimed. I had no idea. Yes, you're very lucky, Mr. Curran said. You're the last executive promoted before the improvement. It's a proud tradition, Martina. Several generations of executives have come before you, many of whom were dispatched to the four corners of the world to prepare for the improvement. In fact, many have become important government officials. What will I be doing? Martina asked, her eyes shining with anticipation. You'll start by helping with the sweepers, said Mr. Curran. You've been to the memory terminal, yes? SQ showed you the sweepers? We just came from there. They look exactly like the Whisperer. True, but they are much less powerful, said Mr. Curran, and much less sophisticated. The Whisperer, Martina, is a sensitive, delicately balanced machine that requires my strict guidance for its proper function. Only my Whisperers can bring about the improvement. Here Mr. Curran paused, his face adopting an expression of fond reverie. So the sweepers just bury memories, Martina said. Nothing fancy. Correct, said Mr. Curran. They are much simpler tools than the Whisperer, hardly more sophisticated than metal brooms. Otherwise, my executives would be unable to operate them. This time, it was Martina who nodded, and SQ who did not. In fact, SQ now wore an unusually serious expression. Sir? SQ said timidly, raising his hand. A thought just occurred to me. Mr. Curran raised his eyebrows. That's remarkable, SQ. What is it? Shouldn't we be asking people's permission? I mean, if we're putting things in their heads, shouldn't we ask them first? Martina's jaw dropped with disbelief, but Mr. Curran was long used to the workings of SQ's mind. In fact, SQ had asked this question before, more than once, but had forgotten. With more amusement than impatience, Mr. Curran answered, If we ask permission, SQ, then it doesn't work. Do you want people to be happy or don't you? Oh, I do. Then the answer is no, we should not be asking permission. Do you see? Relieved, SQ nodded. And so, Martina, Mr. Curran concluded, you may now anticipate the improvement with pleasure. As I said, by the day after tomorrow, Mr. Curran's attention shifted to the drain cover in his office floor. How odd. I thought I heard something in the drain. Maybe it's a mouse, SQ ventured. What is that drain for, anyway? Asked Martina. Would you like to tell her, SQ? Said Mr. Curran, still peering towards the saucer-sized grate. I suspect that's something you do remember, grisly details being the most memorable. Oh, yes, sir, replied SQ, eager to prove his knowledge. He cleared his throat importantly. You see, Martina, back in the early days when the Institute was being built and a colony of workers lived on the island, this room was used as a butchery. There was always a lot of blood, of course, gallons of it, and the butchers would watch it down that drain. The drain connects to a culvert which carried everything off to the harbor. They say sharks used to gather in the waters there, drawn by the scent of blood, and workers would fling mice out for them to snap up. Here SQ's face brightened. He'd suddenly remembered something else, and it was rare that he remembered two different things in so short a time. You know what, Mr. Curran? Jackson heard a mouse too, not half an hour ago. We're having a real problem with them lately. "The real problem," said Mr. Curtin, "is that we hear these mice and never see them." Rolling to his desk, he took up a pot of hot water SQ had brought him for his tea. "It may be that our mice have grown better at hiding. However, it occurs to me that although the drain pipe is mouse-sized, the culvert is human-sized and would provide a perfect hiding place for some bold eavesdropper who managed to find its entrance." Even as he spoke, he shot across the room and dumped the steaming contents of the pot down the drain. He waited, listening carefully, but not a sound reached him save the gurgling of hot water as he drained away. Perhaps it was a mouse after all, or the echo of harbor traffic. Pipes do have strange acoustic effects. For a moment he stared at the empty pot, somewhat lost in thought, then said, I do want my tea, however. SQ, run over to the cafeteria and bring me another pot of water, and some pastries, too. Here, I'd better write it down for you." The note Mr. Curtin handed to SQ had nothing to do with tea or pastries. It read, "Go at once to the culvert opening on the south shore. Bring Jackson along. If you find no one, search the sand near the opening for footprints. Hurry." SQ read the note, read it again, glanced up to express his puzzlement, and saw Mr. Curtin lay a finger to his lips. Understanding dawned on him then, and, tripping in his great haste, he left the room. Kate's ear had been to the pipe when she heard the splash. She'd barely had time to jerk her head back before the hot water had gushed out. Even then, a little splashed onto her neck, and it was all Kate could do to hold in a gasp. Then she heard Mr. Curtin send SQ away, and, suspecting a trap, she beat a quick retreat down the culvert to the shore. As she emerged into the night air, Kate spotted two figures, SQ and Jackson, though in the dark she couldn't tell this, burst out from behind the Institute Control Building and raced across the plaza for the shore. In moments they would be upon her. There was nowhere to go but the water. Kate plunged in and dove deep. It was shockingly cold. Too cold for sharks, she hoped, for what SQ had said just before Mr. Curtin dumped the water was much on her mind. That butchery business was long ago. Surely by now the sharks would be out of the habit of congregating here, she hoped. Anyway, she could hardly return to shore, so in the water she must stay. Fortunately, Kate was an excellent swimmer. Heading out into the channel, she stayed underwater as long as she could, emerged briefly to gulp air, and dove under again. When at last she surfaced and looked back, she'd put a good distance between herself and the shore, and saw to her relief that she wasn't being pursued. Perhaps she hadn't even been seen. Good. She would just need to swim down the coastline and find a safe, inconspicuous place to sneak aground. Kate turned, looked at the water ahead, and gasped. She'd seen what she expected to be the last thing she ever saw. A shape triangular and black, slicing towards her through the dark water. Fear coursed through her body like an electric shock. She braced herself for the brutal, dagger-like teeth, and in that split second of waiting, managed to wonder if it would be the shark's bite that killed her, or if instead she would be snatched away deep down to drown in a bloody darkness. In the next moment, she saw that the shark fin was only a rock. The fear drained away, but the after-effects of panic remained, sharpening at Kate's senses. With her heart thudding like bass drums in her ear, she looked around. Jagged rocks pierced the water surface all about her. Amid the murk of night and the sloshing of 1,000 tiny waves, most of them appeared to be moving. More than a few resembled shark fins. Perhaps a few even were. Good grief, she said, for she had no choice but to swim right through them. She'd have to be careful not to cut herself to ribbons on their sharp edges, and she'd have to hope none of them were actually sharks. Sacrifices, narrow escapes, and something like a plan. By the time she crept into Rainey and Sticky's room half an hour later, Kate was in a better mood. Which is to say, she was disappointed with her mission, miserably cold, soaked to the bone, and in a good deal of physical pain. But at least she hadn't been eaten by a shark. At the sound of squishing shoes and a strange, rapid little clicking sound, the boys awoke to see Kate giving their radiator a bear hug, her teeth chattering furiously, her clothes dripping water. "Kate!" they cried in barely contained whispers. "What happened? Are you all right?" Well, she stammered, unable for the moment to continue. Rainey threw his blanket over her shoulders, and when at last she grew warmer, Kate told them everything. She omitted, however, the part about the imagined shark. No sense getting into all that. "Luckily I had my bucket secured with my belt," she said, "or I'd have lost it for sure. Even so, I did lose a few things, and my pen light is waterlogged, and my fingers were too numb to grip anything, so I couldn't climb into the ceiling. I had to sneak down the corridor. Can't believe I didn't bump into Jolson or somebody." "I can't believe you managed to eavesdrop through that drain pipe," Sticky said. "How did you even think about it?" "A lucky guess," Kate said. "Rainey mentioned that drain in the floor when he first told us about Mr. Kern's office. Then last night Milligan pointed out the culvert to us. Drains and culverts, I put two and two together and hope for the best." Rainey had been rummaging for an extra towel. He handed it to Kate. So there's actually absolutely no way we can get into that computer room? Kate shook her head reluctantly. She hated to admit it. All right, he said. Nice job, Kate. Nice job? But I didn't accomplish a thing. Are you kidding? Now that we know we can't reach the computer room, we won't waste time trying. And we don't have any time to waste. By the day after tomorrow, we'll have no chance at all. We know that now, too, thanks to you. It's all crucial information. Kate shrugged dismissively, but secretly she was pleased. She opened and closed her hands. The feeling seemed to be returning to her fingers. Rainey was concentrating. There was no message broadcast at the moment. The storm system in his mind had moved out. And what was that he said, Kate? About his whisperer being a sensitive machine? Sensitive and delicately balanced, said Sticky, and it requires his strict mental guidance for its proper function. I think that's what he said, Kate admitted. I tried hard to remember it just as he said it, but I don't have quite the memory you do. All right, we'd better report all this to Mr. Benedict right away, Sticky said, scrambling up onto the television. Instantly, he groaned. Jackson's out on the plaza with SQ. He's yelling at SQ about something. Sticky and I will wait them out, Rainey said. Kate, you should change into dry clothes and go on to bed. No point all three of us staying. Just then another broadcast began. They all grimaced. Rainey felt the storm system move into his mind again. Good grief, I hope this one doesn't keep me awake, said Kate with a sigh. I'll go lay these clothes on my radiator and try to sleep anyway. We only have a day or so to save the world. We'll need all the rest we can get. Sleep she did. Kate was so tired from her night's exertion that she slept through the wake-up announcement and was late getting ready for breakfast. Constance was no help either. When Kate had returned her in the middle of the night, she had awakened Constance to fill her in, and afterwards Constance was even sleepier than usual. So both girls were snoozing soundly when Jacqueline banged on their door. Kate dreamed she was back in the circus being fired from a cannon. Up! Jolson shouted, rapping again with such force that the girl's window rattled in its frame. Help her stop serving breakfast. In 15 minutes, girls. Waking with a start, Kate leaped out of bed, threw on some clothes, and snatched her shoes from the radiator. They hadn't dried much, unfortunately. Then she shook Constance awake, or at least into a groggy stupor. Come on, Connie girl, we've got to get moving. Constance smacked her lips, blinked a few times, and said, Don't call me Right, sorry. After a lot of hustling and cajoling, Kate got Constance moving, then quick stepped into the cafeteria with the smaller girl riding piggyback. And she spotted the boys at their usual table and squished over to them. But for some reason, Rainey's eyes widened at Kate's approach, and no sooner had she sat down beside him than he said loudly, There you are! Let me pour you some juice, Kate! With unusual awkwardness, he grabbed a juice fixture, lost his grip, and ended up squashing an entire quart of juice all over Kate's feet. At a nearby table, a group of messengers burst out laughing. Good grief, Rainey, Kate said. I can pour my own juice, all right. In an undertone, Rainey said quickly, Listen, Kate, rumors have been flying all morning. They know someone was in the culvert and swam away to escape. Your soggy shoes are a dead giveaway. Everybody saw me spill that juice, so now you have a reason other than harbor water. Yikes, Kate said. Thanks, buddy. And wipe that grin off your face, Constance. You don't always have to enjoy it so much, you know. As the girls wolfed down their breakfast, Rainey and Sticky filled them in. After Kate left the room, they'd finally had the opportunity to send Mr. Benedict a report, but to their enormous disappointment, Mr. Benedict hadn't been able to reply. Jackson and SQ had returned to the plaza, this time with Mr. Kern, who, like Jackson, was clearly furious with SQ about something and kept shaking his finger in SQ's face. We wondered why SQ was in so much trouble, Sticky said, and this morning we found out. Everybody's heard about it. Jackson and SQ failed to catch the spy, but they did find footprints in the sand at the culvert entrance, footprints leading down into the water. What? Said Kate, freezing with a forkful of scrambled eggs halfway to her mouth. Oh no, I meant to wipe away the prints, but then I didn't have time. She reddened, ashamed, and set down her fork. I'm sorry, everybody. They'll match my shoes to the prints, you know they will, and then it's... Why are you both shaking your heads? Because you have nothing to worry about, said Rainey. Sticky broke into a grin. SQ took care of the problem for us. Those big feet of his came in very handy for once. He found the footprints all right and followed them down to the shore, but in the process his own footprints destroyed them completely. That's why Mr. Curran is furious. Huh, Kate said, profoundly relieved. Here's to good old SQ. We're still in a tight spot, Rainey said. Mr. Curran will be watching everybody very... And oh, don't you find these Danishes splendid, Sticky? They go down wonderfully well with cold milk, especially the raspberry ones. Sticky wasn't puzzled by the change of subject. He too had seen Jackson and Martina approaching the table. He was responding earnestly that he preferred the cinnamon rolls when Jackson drew up and said with a sneer, "George, forgive me for interrupting your very interesting conversation about breakfast foods, but Martina and I are making an inspection. No doubt you've all heard about the spy." "We have," Rainey said, "and we can hardly believe it. Why on earth would a spy be at the Institute?" Jackson knuckled Rainey painfully on the head. "If you would use your brain, Muldoon, you might figure a few things out. The spy obviously hopes to steal some of Mr. Kern's secret technology, then sell it to someone who might use it for wicked purposes." "That would be terrible," Kate said. Rainey was rubbing his head. "Anyway, yes, we've heard about the spy. And yet one thing you probably have not heard about is this." Jackson reached into his pocket and drew out a marble. Kate's marble. "The spy is a marble?" Rainey asked. "Ha ha, young man. Ha ha. No, this marble happens to have been found somewhere last night. Somewhere, let me put it this way, somewhere it should not have been." "That seems a reasonable way to put it," Rainey said. Martina leaned forward, peering into Kate's bucket. "So Jackson and I are looking for the marble's owner. I don't want to point any fingers," she said silkily, "but it seemed to me Kate's bucket might be a good place to look. She has so many odds and ends in there, you know." Rainey and Sticky tried to appear unconcerned, but their minds were in turmoil. Kate mentioned losing a few things in the water last night, but she said nothing about the marbles and slingshot. "Mind if we have a look?" Martina asked, already reaching. "Not at all," replied Kate. Before Martina could actually touch anything, she dumped the bucket's contents onto the table: a magnet, a Swiss Army knife, a spool of twine, a kaleidoscope, and a rope, which was damp, but you couldn't tell without touching it. No marbles, no slingshot. "Oh," said Martina with a look of bitter disappointment. "Okay, then," said Jackson. "Just checking. We have other people to ask, so we'll leave you to continue your fascinating conversation. Come on, Martina." With some effort, he drew the reluctant Martina away. Kate winked. "I may not know when the Cenozoic era was." Sticky was aghast. "Kate, we live in the Cenozoic era. Sure, it began 65 million years ago, but—" "What I was going to say," Kate continued stubbornly, "is that I may not know when the Cenozoic era was, but I wasn't born yesterday." "What on earth are you people talking about?" asked Constance. "She just means to say she's not stupid," said Rainey. "So you got rid of the marbles and the slingshot on purpose, Kate?" "Of course. I figured you'd find that marble, so I had to dump the others. I sure hated to. I won most of them in a game with a lion tamer." "Poor Kate," said Constance. "She's lost her marbles." Everyone but Kate was chuckling about this one, when Martina and Jackson, halfway across the cafeteria, suddenly seemed to change their minds and return to their table. An intimidating look of cruel pleasure on Martina's face dried up all their laughter and made them wait in silence for the explanation. "Jackson forgot to mention something else," Martina said. "He just so happened to spit out a piece of licorice last night in the same place he found that marble. But when he looked for it later, it was gone." Rainey found Kate stiffened next to him. They were in trouble. "Funny thing about licorice," said Jackson. "It's just the sort of thing to get stuck in the bottom of your shoe without you realizing it." I get it," said Kate, squirming in her seat. "So now you want to see the bottoms of my shoes?" "If you'd be so kind," Martina said with a wicked grin. She'd noticed Kate squirming and was delighted to think she'd frightened her. "Well, sorry about the dripping, but Rainey just spilled juice all over them," Kate said. "Oh, yes, we saw that," Jackson said. He let out a amused rattle of laughter that sounded like a sheep in pain. While Jackson was bleeding at her expense, Kate pressed something sticky, gritty, and cold into Rainey's hand beneath the table. She hadn't been squirming from nervousness. She'd been twisting her legs up to get at the licorice. As she lifted her sodden shoes now for the executives to inspect, Rainey reached across from under the table and pressed the hunk of licorice into Sticky's hand. The further away from Kate, the better, he thought. Sticky had the same idea, immediately passing the licorice on to Constance. Constance, unfortunately, did not understand what it was. In horror, the boys watched her raise the slimy, dirty, half-chewed glob of candy above the tabletop to examine it. Rainey's eyes swiveled to the executives, who, having been disappointed in Kate's shoes, were now asking her to show her empty hands, then checking for stickiness under the edge of the table. He looked back to Constance and saw the realization hit her, her eyes widening with alarm. And then, a moment before Martina glanced up to see it, Constance popped the licorice into her mouth, chewed it up, and swallowed it. Ew, that was the most disgusting thing I've ever seen, Sticky said later when the crisis had passed and the executives were off harassing other children. Constance's cheeks, normally a rosy red, had turned a faint shade of green. Disgusting, yes, but heroic, Rainy said. We all have to make sacrifices, Constance muttered miserably. What we need to make is a decision, said Kate. We need a plan, and quick. Does anyone have any ideas? I'm fresh out. Constance only groaned and put her hand in her hands. I do have one thing to say, said Rainy, then hesitated. He had intended to say that he couldn't face the Whisper again, that the mere thought of it turned his mind to jelly, so how much worse would it be if he actually experienced the Whisper again? Wouldn't he be certain to give up? This was what Rainy had meant to say, but now he found he couldn't. He was too ashamed. Constance groaned again without looking up. Rainy, you're the king of saying you have something to say than not actually saying anything. Do you realize that? Sorry, Rainy said. I forgot. He was not the only one at the table with troubled thoughts. Sticky felt the same way Rainy did, and Kate was still wishing she'd been able to sabotage those computers to have solved the dilemma all on her own. And having failed to do that, she was trying to pretend to herself that she hadn't. Constance, meanwhile, was trying not to contemplate what might happen to her when Mr. Kernan boosted the messages to full power. Thus, all the children were trying not to think of things instead of trying to think of things, and trying not being generally less productive than trying. They weren't coming up with ready answers. In the midst of going round and round in his mind about not facing the Whisperer, however, Rainy did stumble against something which, if seen from a distance and not stared at directly, might resemble a plan. 100 times he thought to himself, I can't face the Whisperer again. But this time, for some reason, he had tacked on the word, alone. And this was how he stumbled against the plan-like thing. Okay, everyone, I think I do have a plan now. Didn't Mr. Benedict tell us that we must rely upon one another in all things? That every single one of us is essential to the success of the team? We have to take into account that we need each other. That's the plan, Constance said, to give each other big hugs. Rainy ignored her. I was thinking, maybe if we faced Mr. Kernan and his Whisperer together, we could figure out what to do. You mean all of us in the Whispering Gallery at the same time, said Constance doubtfully. With Mr. Curtin there, what could we possibly do? I don't know yet, Rainy admitted. But there's Milligan too, remember? If we contact him, we'll have him to help us. I say it's worth a try, said Kate. We're running out of time. How do we manage it? Should Constance and I sneak in while you two are having your sessions? Rainy considered. The door is considered like by a button in Mr. Kern's chair, so you can't sneak in. But Sticky and I could press the button to let you in. There's at least one problem with all this, said Sticky. We weren't to have another turn in the Whisper for at least a few days, remember? By then it will be too late. Kate tried to think. What would be good would be if Mr. Curran won the Nobel Peace Prize. Sticky spewed a mist of chocolate milk. Have you gone off your... Oh, hi there, SQ. What brings you by our table? SQ Battalion looked down upon them dejectedly. Hello, kids. I suppose you heard how I bungled that spy business, wiping out the footprints and all that. You shouldn't feel bad, Rainy said. I doubt anybody could have done a better job. It's nice of you to say, SQ said with a sigh. Then he took a deep breath just so he could sigh again. But enough about pitiful me. I came over to ask about you, Constance. Are you feeling all right? You seem rather, green-colored. I'm afraid we gave her a stomach virus, Rainy interjected. Sticky and I just got over it. SQ looked sympathetic. Oh, yes, the other messengers told me about that stomach bug. It's a nasty one, eh? How do you feel, Constance? Like I ate something revolting, said Constance. I guess that's what I get for hanging around with Rainy and Sticky. Now, SQ observed, nothing better for you than spending time with messengers. Good influence and all that. I mean, stomach bug aside. Let's just hope not too many other people get sick. It would be a shame if classes had to be canceled. There's just too much good stuff to review. They all heartily agreed with SQ, thanked him for stopping by, and nodded as he droned endlessly on about the escaped spy and a good many other things, until finally his jaw was worn out, his mind was empty, and he went away. What we need, said Kate as if they'd never been interrupted, is for you boys to get your turn sooner. Isn't there any chance you could be called on tomorrow? I'm afraid not, Rainy said. Not unless every other messenger suddenly fell ill. Too bad we can't actually give them bellyaches, said Constance. Sticky's ears perked up. Who says we can't? He said.